Welcome to the Design Defect. Steve, what are we doing here this week?
Jamie, this week we're moving on with part 2 of our 4-part series talking about Sega console launch titles across all major territories.
Fantastic. Then we will be diving into the incredibly ugly SG-1000.
That's right. What? No, we're talking about the Sega Genesis, man. What is wrong with you?
I don't know, Steve. Okay, fine. I will cover the first video.
Good.
Space Harrier 2, developed by Sega, takes place in 6236, which is 4,248 years after it was actually released. Fantasyland is again being attacked by evil forces, and it's up to Harrier to single-handedly save the day. Harrier is obviously some sort of superhuman with the ability to vertically fly in all directions except backwards, but he is extremely fragile. If he's touched by anything, he dies. He's a great choice for savior of Sector 214.
Get ready?
Anyway, I haven't played a game quite like this since Panzer Dragoon. Harrier rushes forward as enemies charge at him from the foreground or occasionally zip past him from behind. Nimble controls allow Harrier to agilely slip between columns that never actually support any structures. The frantic music pumps up the adrenaline as Harrier is constantly under attack by a vast array of enemies. I was pleasantly surprised by the number of enemy types I was able to snipe while hovering over or sprinting along the ground. A good number of levels kept the game interesting, each with their own fantasy aesthetic that I appreciated. The graphics aren't bad by any means, and some of the enemies are actually pretty cool. Most importantly, I never felt hindered by the frame rate in this shooter. Space Harrier 2 is a solid original launch title. There are much worse games out there to spend a couple of hours playing for nostalgia's sake.
Super Thunderblade for the Mega Drive was one of 2 launch titles in Japan. It was essentially a follow-up to Thunderblade in the arcades released in 1987, and if you've ever played any Star Fox game, then you'll feel right at home here, especially thanks to the intense frame rate. It's honestly much closer to Space Harrier 2, but that game performs much better, and is a lot more fun to play than Super Thunderblade. Let me just say that I actually like Thunderblade. I think the arcade game is awesome, and I think the 3DS Sega Classics version is stellar. But this launch title for the Genesis wasn't impressive at the time and is even less so now. The controls are sluggish, sure. I don't expect the Genesis to replicate the awesome scaling effects of the objects in the arcade, but redrawn sprites that emulate the scaling are absolutely terrible. I mean, seriously, it looks more like a bug than a feature most of the time, especially with larger objects like these buildings. Ugh. It's almost like they had a meeting to discuss what else they could ruin about this arcade classic beyond just the scaling and said, oh, I know, we can make it feel like your helicopter is responsive as a cruise ship in the Caribbean. Awesome! The game may look fast, but it feels so slow. It's essentially something that can't be explained and must be experienced, but please spare yourself and go experience something else. If you really want to check out what the Thunderblade series is all about, you can't go wrong with the incredible 3DS version.
I don't care if you judge me for how poorly I played Tommy Lasorda baseball. Maybe I'm just weak, but I simply couldn't devote more than 15 minutes to playing this game. For those of you who might be interested in sports trivia, Lasorda was the manager of the LA Dodgers when he endorsed the eponymous baseball game. He was born in 1927, just a year before bread was first automatically sliced prior to packaging, so I'm pretty curious how the request for his endorsement went since I doubt he was a gamer. Now for the game itself, this is certainly no World Series baseball for the Saturn, which I sunk countless hours into dominating family and friends. I'm trying to take into account that a decade passed between the release of the two, but I found Lasorda baseball tedious and boring. After just a few minutes, I muted the uninspired, repetitive music and sat in my game room playing Lasorda baseball in silence until I felt that I had enough gameplay footage to prove I played the game. The graphics aren't terrible, but everything from the sprites to the color palette are just plain bland. If you are a huge Tommy Lasorda fan in need of the full Lasorda multimedia experience, then I recommend taking a few minutes just to stare at the airbrushed box art. That chin dimple alone is pretty impressive. Otherwise, give this game a pass.
Left fielder. Out.
Altered Beast is a side-scrolling beat-em-up released in 1988 to the arcades and is a classic launch title for the Genesis. Published and developed by Sega, this was a game for the time it was released in, and while it's still fun today, I think it's fun for very different reasons than it may have been upon its original release. Let's start with the graphics. While inferior to the arcade version, the Genesis version introduced an important aesthetic to the game in the form of parallax scrolling. Parallax scrolling in 2D side-scrollers helps the environments come to life, and it was nice to see the Genesis pushing this feature right out of the gate to prove how powerful it was. The transformation cinematics were mind-blowing at the time, taking up the entire screen, and honestly, I think they're still super cool today. My favorite beast has to be this dumpy bear with the blood-red eyes. I know none of the creatures you play as in any way are natural, but this is one of the goofiest and most incredible sprites I've ever seen in a video game. I mean, look at how ready he is to fight off the minions of hell in his intimidating battle-ready stance. Sick! I really dig the music in the game, and I think a lot of the tracks still hold up today. I'm sure everyone remembers the track from the first level, but check out this catchy Game Over track. I know it doesn't really fit the game, but I still feel like a better person for having heard it. Anyway, all the beasts control very differently from each other, and the first few bosses are kind of a breeze as long as you're fully powered up. Like I said earlier, this game is still fun today, but I think the fun is in trying to get good enough to beat the 15-minute experience in one run. It's really not that hard, you just have to be patient, cheese the first few bosses, and then rise from your grave or something. Seriously, it's not a bad game in the right context. If you don't go into it expecting high-level platforming, but rather a dumbed-down action game with giant half-naked dudes that turn into completely naked monsters, then you'll have a great time, I promise. So Jamie, did you play any system sellers yet for the Mega Drive?
I just need to be playing the vastly superior SG-1002.
Jamie, are you even listening to me, man?
No, I'm gonna take us into the next video.
Okay.
Golden Axe is a side-scrolling hack-and-slash game in which the player tries to track down Death Adder, only to discover, if you're playing on the Genesis and a couple other systems, that the actual final boss is Adder's mentor, Deathbringer. Progress through to the extra final level where Deathbringer resides has the adventurers passing through Turtle Village, which rests on the back of a giant turtle, a la Morla, the ancient one in the never-ending story. Death Adder slayed the twin brother of Gilius Thunderhead, the battle-axe-wielding dwarf. Not only that, he killed Gilius' friend Alex and took over the land of Uria. Gilius could not let these sins go unpunished, and I sensed that righteous fury within the dwarf, which is why I chose him over the barbarian Axe Battler and the Amazonian Tyrius Flair. The magic system is a nice touch, where each of the warriors has access to magical abilities, some more powerful than the others, depending on their class. The dwarf had the weakest magic, but I was alright with that. Little goblins with sacks of potions or food would occasionally run around in intermission portions of the levels, and kicking the goblins would cause them to drop their loot to allow the refilling of health or mana. Pretty often enemies ride in on mounts, and a quick attack would knock them off, allowing the player to counterattack with a weaker cockatrice or a more powerful dragon. This game has been labeled a classic, and rightfully so. It appears in bundles and has been ported to multiple systems over the years. Golden Axe is made up of solid gameplay mixed with good graphics and interesting characters. Of the Genesis launch titles I've played, this is, without a doubt, the best. Sega should have been awarded the Golden Axe for creating this game instead of Gilius.
Alex Kidd in the Enchanted Castle was the first and final 16-bit adding for Sega's former premier action platform Hero. If you know me, you know that I love platformers, and never having played any Alex Kidd game before, I was pretty excited to give this one a test run. Now, before we even get into the gameplay, let's just take a quick look at the cover art for this game. Tell me that if you saw this game sitting on a store shelf as a child, that you would have any interest at all in saving up your hard-earned cash to buy this. I know he's supposed to be some kind of monkey kid, but what's with the rest of the stuff on the cover? What's this? What is this? And could the game worlds be any more generic? As with any game you play, the first few things you notice are always the graphics and the sound. Let's start with the sound. The audio exists. Moving on now. These graphics are easily the worst of the Genesis launch titles, and I think they're even worse than any of the Master System launch titles as well. I think this could easily be mistaken for an 8-bit game, but it's not. Okay, now a quick note on the story. I've worked on a lot of video games ranging from indie to AAA, and granted, I don't go back to the 16, 32-bit, or even 64-bit era of video game development, but if anyone suggests an island where everyone is obsessed with playing paper, rock, scissors as the theme for the game, they would be laughed out of the office. But if it was actually taken a step further and made a critical component to the gameplay, I would laugh myself out of the office. I'm generally pretty optimistic when it comes to games, and especially retro games, but this is one of the worst ideas I've ever seen implemented in a platformer. Want an item? Okay, that'll be $100, and then a game of random chance to see if you get anything at all. Got to the boss fight? Get ready for the most epic battle of rock, paper, scissors you'll ever have. I didn't even make it far enough to show you a boss fight because I was too bored playing this game. I have a long list, but I'll spare poor Alex Kidd and just be grateful that Sonic came along to take his place before I got a chance to know he existed.
My wife generously played Sega's Columns with me so that you could be thrilled by the spirit of competition. She requested that I let you know that I didn't warn her that, unlike Tetris, Columns does not allow you to rotate the pieces. When she let loose with that excuse, I promptly responded that the game is called Columns, not Rows. I was then disciplined for my insubordination. Columns allows the player to cycle the 3 jewels in the stack to line up 3 or more of the same jewels to make them disappear and generate points. Like Tetris, pieces constantly fall, but the play has to be hastily made, and I do mean hastily. On any mode but easy, the columns ram-jam their way to the bottom, and if you're in your mid-30s and haven't played Tetris in decades or Candy Crush in years, you will fail. There's a couple of modes to choose from, none of which fundamentally change the gameplay. The color scheme can be changed, but there's not a lot more I could say other than there's a Grecian motif at the beginning of the game and then some angels for whatever reason. It's definitely a puzzle game.
Last Battle for the Genesis is sort of a graphical powerhouse for the console, especially at launch. Featuring multiple layers of parallax scrolling and lots of giant sprites running around on the screen, this is certainly a game that showed off what your new 16-bit console could do back in 1989. Last Battle is a game that I really wanted to love upon revisiting it, especially because of how much I found myself enjoying Altered Beast, but there was one major hurdle that I wasn't able to get over for this review. The game is essentially a super long version of Altered Beast, but with only 1 life and 0 continues. No thanks. Released in Japan as Fist of the North Star, the new legend of the post-apocalyptic messiah, based on the Fist of the North Star manga, there aren't a lot of differences between the 2 games, but one difference in particular stands out and at least makes the game much more tolerable to push through on your own time. See how boring it is having the bodies just fly off the screen in the American release of Last Battle? Wouldn't it be cooler if their heads exploded and moments later their bodies hover in midair before rupturing into a bloodbath? Well, then check out the Japanese version of the game. It's not that the game needed blood to be better, it's just that the death animations are pathetic and completely unsatisfying in Last Battle. Consider Mortal Kombat on the Super Nintendo, and that was a joke for the same reason. As a fighting game, it was honestly horrible, even at the time, but the gratuitous special effects and blood splattering all over the place helped make the game more satisfying both in arcades and the Genesis version. If you have patience or are willing to try out the game on an emulator where you can use save states, you may have a good time with this game, but overall it was just disappointing.
Sometimes I play these retro titles just to be able to snag some gameplay footage to crank out a review, but Technosoft's Thunder Force 2 is actually enjoyable. After playing the first level, I did not expect the game to go from top-down shooter to side-scroller. The playstyle alternates for several levels, each of which has its own personality and charm. I found Thunder Force 2 challenging but not punishing. It is this generation of consoles that I feel publishers were beginning to get a better grip on sharp controls. Several power-ups facilitate victory against some evil empire who is hiding their power battleship within a planet named Nebula, because obviously, the player can alternate between a powerful forward shot and a weaker weapon that fires both forward and backward. As the pilot of the Fire Leo 2 quickly advances along the surface of planet Nebula, power-ups become available. As in basically all early shooters, the player gets access to spread shot and lasers, along with a little fella called a claw that circles around the ship providing extra firepower. The graphics are good for a launch title from this generation of consoles. The gameplay is sharp enough not to cause frustration while dodging enemy shots. While the free-roaming top-down perspective can be a little awkward at times, leading to collision deaths due to a lack of throttle, the side-scrolling gameplay is smooth as butter. Free-roaming aspect separates Thunder Force 2 from other side-scrolling shooters of the period. My final thought, it's worth a quick playthrough. Steve, so tell me about your Sega Genesis experience so far.
Well, overall, Jamie, I kind of enjoyed it. No, I can't, dude. Alex Kidd is one of the worst games I've ever played. It was by far the worst launch title on the system. It looked worse than any of the Master System games that we covered. Their creative genius was able to come up with an island called Paper Rock Island. That's where it took place. Really?
Steve,
the
come
design
back.
of the game was centered around playing
killing the
paper,
video.
rock, scissors to purchase items, and for boss fights. The boss fights weren't boss fights. You had to do best out of 3 for paper, rock, scissors. It was the most ludicrous concept I think I've ever encountered in not just any platformer, but any game period. Add to that the horrendous controls.